Ambassador Fernandez, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you virtually, Guy.
Okay, thanks so much. So let's speak about the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. If you can provide us with a little background about the networks, what their purpose are, and how things have changed over the last decade.
Well, MBN, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, was its genesis was after 9/11. After 2001, the U.S. government felt that it had not succeeded in communicating well enough with populations in the region in Arabic. I think there was particular frustration in Washington at the time about Al Jazeera and the fact, or the perception, that Al Jazeera was promoting kind of anti-Americanism. Talking about the perception here in Washington. That's the perception that there was in Washington and in the Bush administration about Al Jazeera. 2001, 2002, you may remember they were facilitating the Bin Laden videos and all of that. So the U.S. already had done Arabic on the Voice of America, but it was felt that that was not good enough. So the U.S. government began by first starting a chain or group of FM radio stations in the region, which is Radio Sawa, which is part of MBN. And then after that, they went from radio to television. That was Al Hurra Television. So that's 2000, we're talking about 2002, 2003, 2004, that all came online. So it's been around now for 15, 16 years. MBN includes Al Hurra Television, Al Hurra Iraq Television, which is a separate stream, Radio Sawa, which is broken up into Radio Sawa Iraq, a kind of Radio Sawa Levant stream, so one for, Syria, Lebanon, Palestinian territories, Jordan, Israel in Arabic. And soon to come a Sawa Sudan stream. And then a very large social media component, alhurra.com, radiosawa.com, and 3 kind of specialized platforms, social media platforms, one specializing in North Africa, one specializing in Egypt, and one specializing in Iraq/Syria with a kind of counterterrorism, countering violent extremism focus. So that's the organization. It's based here in the beautiful Springfield, Virginia, with many, many people in the region and big bureaus today in Dubai, especially a news bureau in Dubai. We do news from the region in Dubai, and large bureaus in Beirut and Jerusalem and Cairo, etc. So that's kind of what it looks like. How it's changed? Well, it's changed because I took over about 3 years ago, and many people thought that this was a failed enterprise that had totally failed in its goal. And so I was brought in to kind of shake things up and make it different.
Okay, so if the initial goal was to win hearts and minds, what is the new goal of the Middle East Broadcasting Network?
Well, I think in public diplomacy, and as you know, I'm an old public diplomacy officer, winning hearts and minds is not a bad thing, and it's something we should always have in mind. But I see it as a much more kind of aggressive tool of public diplomacy. I believe that you have, in broadcasting, you have 2 goals or 2 overlapping missions. One is to basically present the United States to foreign audiences, right? Mm-hmm. You can say that's kind of the VOA model. And then you have the goal of surrogate broadcasting. That's basically presenting an alternate worldview in places where that worldview is not allowed. The perfect example is our sister network, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was founded to broadcast to the captive nations of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which still exists. It's based in Prague. So MBN, Al Hurra, and Sawa have both missions. We have the mission of presenting America to Arab audiences, but also presenting kind of an alternate vision of the region that they can't get from the region itself, because voices are stifled, because people are not allowed to speak on certain issues and certain topics. So what I've done is very aggressively gone after that, you could say, that second mandate. Yes, we present U.S. foreign policy. We cover the administration of the president or the Secretary of State or Congress. Congressional leaders say things. We cover that, and we should, and we're supposed to. But then also presenting a kind of a specific vision that we have of the region, a vision that is much more about, and I use these words in Arabic, they might sound better in Arabic, maybe they sound corny in English, is about enlightenment and about human dignity and about a full expression of freedom, and about telling the truth regardless of the consequences, being aggressive about investigative news and human rights and regime corruption, etc. So that's the, you say, the other part of what we've tried to do. We've done a lot. We've made a lot of changes in the 3 years I've been there, but that's kind of a philosophical one. That the way media is in the Arab world, and I think this is true in the West as well, if you're just producing kind of vanilla, plain, ordinary stuff, the same stuff you find everywhere else, you're going to get lost in the noise. You have to have, you know, a voice and not an echo of others. So that's why we've tried to be very aggressive about talking about things that others maybe are not going to want to talk about. You know, the joke in the region is that you can hear bad things about some countries, but only from their adversaries, right? So the Saudis and the Emiratis will tell you about the terrible things about, say, Qatar and Turkey, you know? And then the Qataris will tell you everything bad you want to know about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt, you know, their opponents. We can talk about all of them, our enemies, our friends, our frenemies, you know, our allies, human rights abuses by our friends, horrific, actions by, you know, the Assad regime or Iran or Russia or China. That's a big priority for us, those 4 countries. But we can do it all. We don't have to shy away from sacred cows. There are no sacred cows here. And so we have the freedom to talk about these things, with great confidence.
Well, this is great. This is the content, but let's talk about a limitation of American broadcasting, which is the source. There are a lot of folks out there who will simply tune out of these kind of broadcast arms simply because they know they are American sponsored, right? So, and back in the day, I even heard that the radio network, right, Radio Sawa, converted to music mostly, right? Because they had no success in engagement on the news side.
Well, that's actually not true. Sawa was designed from the beginning to be mostly music with a little bit of news. I mean, that was the initial kind of pattern for it. So that they didn't change it because they failed. In fact, Sawa was a big success. You could say the problem was its success, that it was mostly empty. It was mostly music with just news headlines, but it was successful. On the it's American and it's propaganda. I always laugh at that because, of course, the media in the region is entirely propagandistic or almost entirely propagandistic. So I laugh when somebody says, oh, Al-Hurra has no credibility because it only parrots the American administration. First of all, that's not true. And I can give you dozens of examples of where that's not true. The ones who parrot administrations are the Al Jazeeras, the Al Arabiyas, the others. Because you can go on Al-Hurra, for example, and you can hear the President of the United States, and you can hear critics of the President of the United States criticizing his policies. That's the difference between, say, Al-Hurra and RT Arabic, right? That's the difference. And we, we try to be honest in our coverage. For example, I'll give you a very concrete example. When the Turks incurred or invaded parts of northern Syria and clashed with Kurdish forces, some thought that maybe the President Trump, supported this, right? And he was okay with it. We were reporting from the Kurdish side. We were reporting from the Turkish side too. We have reporters in Turkey, but we were reporting from Rojava, from the Syrian Kurdish, YPG side as well, who are saying these Turks are terrorists, these are coming in. So we had both sides, and who are criticizing the American administration. Where are the Americans, our allies who helped us against ISIS, who we fought for against ISIS? So if you're watching, say, our coverage of Syria Kurdish area and the YPG and all of that, you certainly can't say, look at us, we followed the administration 100%. We didn't. And so alternate voices are there always. When the president held, for example, announced the moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, we covered the president, of course. We covered his statement in full. We covered the Q's and A's, all of that. During the day, we had commentary on that. And we had people who thought it was great, and we had people who thought it was terrible, who thought it was awful. We had commentators on both sides during the day. That's something you're not going to see with some of our critics, Well,
let's talk about that. So essentially, you're very well articulating the American model of international broadcasting, which is really, this is Voice of America and the Radio Free Europe and Asia and all the networks, right? Which says the United States in its sponsored broadcasting does not engage in propaganda like the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, but rather we have a more free journalistic form where we demonstrate our values through the practice of free speech and free journalism, right? When you compare those two models, right, the pure journalism model on the American side and the more propagandistic model on the rival side, from a audience point of view, do you think they can really differentiate between the two?
I agree with you. I think that the kind of the American vanilla, we're presenting both sides, you decide model is flawed in a kind of propagandistic environment, However, kind of, a rich propagandistic environment like what you have in the Middle East. However, we have no choice. We have to try to work hard to bring balance to our news coverage. But I think there are two caveats. One, we have current affairs programs. And in our current affairs program, we are not balanced. We have our own agenda. We have our own worldview, We're critics of authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes. We're critics of Russia, China, and Iran, of Islamists and jihadists. And if you watch our current affairs shows, you're not going to see balance. They're unbalanced because we think we're right and we think they're wrong. Now, there's a difference between the news and an opinion program. That's the way I see it, The second part I would say is, while we have to be scrupulously professional and balanced in our news coverage, there's nothing that says that you have to be balanced, whatever that means, in your choice of what to cover, right? And that's where you have editorial discretion. Of course, there are, rules of information being well sourced, of relying on multiple sources, of getting the facts right. But if I decide that it's important to cover, for example, as we do, Iranian interference in the affairs of Iraq, and we have a huge audience in Iraq, or Hezbollah hegemony in Lebanon, we do that. Those are issues of interest to the editorial management of this organization, meaning me. So we cover that. That's where actually you do have any media outlet has a choice, and I think that's a legitimate choice in deciding what to cover. And people can criticize you and say, well, why didn't you cover this other thing? I remember early on I had the staff, I was very new. I wanted to test their ability. So I wanted them to cover something which they never covered, which was the opioid crisis. This is way back in 2017, the opioid crisis in the United States. And they produced an hour of that. And we put it on. Some people liked it. Some people criticized it. You can imagine what they said. They said, why are you showing the ugly side of the United States? Yes, we know you Americans are all a bunch of drug addicts and stuff like that. But the reason we did that is we followed that up with an hour on the drug crisis in the Arab world. And we had reports of opioid crisis, which exists. People don't talk about it. Exists in places like Iraq, just as much as you would see in Middle America. The same opioids, the same fentanyl and stuff like that, brought in from Iran, hooking young people in Iraq to this day. And hashish in Lebanon, and pills, Captagon here and there. So, you always have a choice in deciding what to cover. Like I said, we try to cover things fairly in the news, and I think we're successful. But we're very interested in the misdeeds of America's adversaries in the region: Russia, China, Iran, the jihadists, and their Islamist enablers. And that's a perfectly legitimate editorial line to take.
Absolutely. Right. Well, let's talk about the media ecology of the Middle East. You mentioned the Russians. We have RT, we have Press TV from Iran, we have Al Arabiya from Saudi Arabia, Al Jazeera from Qatar. Even Hezbollah has its own broadcasting arm, right? How would you describe the role of international broadcasting in today's international relations environment?
Well, if you're talking about the Arab world or the Middle East in Arabic, it's a saturated market. There are a couple of hundred satellite stations. I break them up into kind of three parts. First, the most important one, the biggest one, is regime media, right? Overwhelmingly, the most important part of media in the region is regime media. And that's best typified by Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, which represent the interests of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But there are others, other pan-Arabs or national networks, which often have less audience, say, Jordan television or, whatever, Syrian television, etc. Then you have the Islamist media, much lower down in terms of number, but still influential. This would include Al-Manar, run by Hezbollah, or Al-Aqsa, which is run by Hamas, or the many Islamist Muslim Brotherhood stations that are funded by the Qataris and based in Turkey, beaming poison into Egypt and places like that. And then you have the third category, which are the foreign surrogates, which are two types. They're the bad guys and the good guys. The Russians and the Iranians, whose media outlets in Arabic are sensationalistic and promote disinformation, promote conspiracy theories, work very closely with each other. So you have Russian and Iranian and Syrian regime and Hezbollah TV tropes and themes overlapping. And then you have kind of the Western pan-Arabs, ourselves, BBC Arabic, Deutsche Welle Arabic, and France 24 Arabic. That's the kind of environment you have. So people we know from polling, people overwhelmingly still get their news in the region from broadcast television, although The market is fragmenting, as you can imagine, and this, cell phones, people getting their information from their phones, social media or television from their phones, TV clips and all of that is the future. So still, broadcast television, very important today, especially for your older audience, but it's becoming more and more about content here. And we're very pleased because our Al-Hurra social media environment, we're doing extremely well. We basically have, 1 million views a day on alhurra.com, much larger numbers than we had a year ago. So our numbers are going through the roof in terms of consumption of our content by cell phones, by mobiles.
Right. And everything you described on the broadcasting front is also happening in the social media front. All of these broadcasters have their own arms on YouTube, on Facebook,
yes.
on Twitter, right? And these
on
days,
Instagram, yes,
Instagram,
yes,
and TikTok coming soon, right?
yeah.
So you spoke about cooperation between different nations. Is there a cooperation between Western nations that you can disclose or speak about?
Well, there is a kind of loose coalition of the Western broadcasters, which is headed by, it's overseen by the parent agency that oversees us, which is the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM. Mm-hmm. So they're the ones that liaise with, the French, the British, the Germans, the others, the Dutch, whatever, but not all of those have Arabic. Mm-hmm. Some of them have Arabic, some of them have other languages and stuff like that. So there is a kind of loose, it's not a close cooperation. We're very different. For example, to be frank, Deutsche Welle Arabic is the smallest of the four in Arabic. France 24 is very strong in North Africa, not surprising. France 24 Arabic is very strong in North Africa, almost non-existent in the rest of the Arab world. BBC Arabic and ourselves are everywhere in the region. And then it varies. For example, we are the #1 foreign broadcaster in Iraq, by far. And we have a very large audience in Iraq. In some other places, it will be somebody else. BBC will be the top foreign broadcaster. Or in say, Algeria, it will be France 24, and maybe we will be down, number 6 or number 7. It varies. It's very regional. It depends a lot on content and viewing patterns. What we have seen since the changes that we've made in the last, say, 18 months, our numbers have improved. We've done extensive, aggressive polling of our numbers in the region, and Al-Hurra's numbers are up everywhere. And in some places, dramatically. Now, in some places, the dramatic improvement is doubling, say, numbers that were small. So say you had 3% of the audience, and now you have 7% of the audience. That's huge, but still 7% is very small, right? So basically, that's where we are right now.
As you said, the competition is fierce. All right, so let's take it back home. Folks back in the United States, most people are not very aware of the history, the tradition, and what the United States is currently doing with international broadcasting, besides maybe Voice of America.
Yeah.
What are some misconceptions do you think that folks back home have about what the United States is trying to do in the Middle East today, and how audiences in the Middle East think about the United States?
Well, I think there's several things. Number one is, of course, sometimes they think that the numbers being spent are much larger than they actually are. That's one thing. Another misconception is that nobody watches this stuff and it doesn't matter. That's a big mistake. I'll give you several examples. When popular demonstrations erupted in Iraq in October of last year, we covered it heavily and sympathetically, because we're sympathetic to people who want human dignity, human rights, a better life for themselves and their families. We should be in favor of that. the Baghdad regime was very angry at us, and threatened us along with others and tried to shut us down. For me, that's a measure of effectiveness. They saw us on the side of the people against the militias, right? Against the state and against the militias. Well, this is where actually the United States should be. So that's actually an important place for us to be. In places like Lebanon, where what's happened is Lebanon on paper seems to be a very dynamic media environment with a lot of freedom. The reality is not that. The reality is that there's less and less freedom in Lebanon for the media, as they're co-opted by either the state or by Hezbollah and friends. So the space for criticism and for free expression in Lebanon is still there if you compare it to other countries, but it's very much under pressure. Very much under pressure. Well, we can go in because we can't be threatened with, we're going to deny you money if you're LBC or MTV and try to squeeze you. We're funded by the US taxpayer. We're funded by Congress. So we can't be threatened by, our money being cut off by these foreign terrorists or dictators or tyrants or autocrats. So that gives us a certain freedom to talk about certain things which are important to our audiences. The key is, and I always said this about public diplomacy in the region, they always said your hearts and minds. They always said American public diplomacy is a failure because everyone hates the United States, right? That's the big cliche. Well, there's hate and there's hate, right? Basically, what you want to do is you want to introduce nuance and context into the conversation. So you make something which our enemies try to portray as black and white. America is the great Satan, right? The embodiment of evil. Well, wait a minute. If you can show that, maybe we don't love America, but America's not that bad. That's kind of exaggerated. There's good and there's bad, like everywhere else. That's actually a plus. Moving people from a position of extreme hatred and opposition to, say, dislike is progress. We don't want to measure that, We say, I think for kind of an American mindset is, if people don't love you, you failed. But I don't think that's actually true, because on that spectrum between love and hate, there are many gradations. And I always saw this in my life as a public diplomacy officer in the region. And I'm not talking about broadcasting. I'm talking about other tools that we used in public diplomacy. Sometimes the biggest success was to introduce that kind of ambiguity or nuance into people's thinking. And it always pays off. It always pays off. They may still dislike the United States. They may still dislike, say, US policy on Israel, but for them to see that America's policies are complex and the reasons for it are multifaceted, and that there are reasons for the way the United States is, this is good. This is not necessarily a bad thing.
Gotcha. Fascinating. Well, Ambassador, we are running out of time, and I don't want to keep you too long, but thank you so much for your insight, your time, and for taking the time to speak to our students here at the university. We wish you lots of success in everything you do over there and your important work, and have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Golan. Pleasure.